I'm Maureen, sitting here in my cozy one-bedroom apartment, looking out at the street. It's hard to believe how far I've come. Just a year ago, I was living in a homeless shelter with no hope and no future in sight. But everything changed the day a woman named Iris knocked on the shelter door and said, "Your grandma hired me to find you. Let me take you back to the small town of Riverdale. It's a place with a population of about 3,500. There's one general store, a high school, and a diner that's been serving the same apple pie since 1990. Everyone in town knows each other, and it's the kind of place where you wave to your neighbors as you drive by." My parents, Victor and Lillian, were respected in the community. Victor worked as a bank manager for 20 years before the bank closed down due to the economic crisis. Lillian was a volunteer at the local animal shelter every weekend. On the surface, we were the picture-perfect family. People would point at us and say, "That's how you raise a daughter, right?" But behind closed doors, things were very different. I didn't get my own house key until I was 21. I wasn't allowed to go out with friends without a detailed itinerary. When I was 15, I got a part-time job at the local bookstore. It was minimum wage, but it was my first taste of independence. However, my paychecks went straight into a joint account that Lillian opened. I never saw a statement, and I never dared to ask. I was a good student, always at the top of my class. I had a teacher, Mr. Thompson, who pulled me aside in my senior year and said, "Maureen, you have the potential to go to a great college. You could get scholarships." I was excited and brought the brochures home. But Victor just scoffed and said, "College is a waste of time. You'll end up in debt and with no real skills." So I stayed in Riverdale, doing odd jobs around the house and listening to Victor complain about the state of the world at dinner every night. He'd look at me across the table and say, "You've got a roof over your head, food on the table, and a family. What else could you possibly want?" For a long time, I didn't have an answer. But then, on my 26th birthday, something inside me snapped. I was standing in the kitchen, doing the dishes, and I thought, if I stay here, I'll be doing the same thing for the rest of my life. The next day, I went to the public library and created a new email address. I found a job listing for a receptionist at a law firm in the neighboring town of Greensfield, about 25 minutes away. I typed up my application and hit send before I could change my mind. 2 days later, I got an email back. They wanted to interview me on Friday at 11 a.m. I read the email over and over again. I was so nervous, but there was also a glimmer of hope. That night at dinner, something felt off. Victor sat at the head of the table, reading the newspaper, and Lillian was unusually quiet. The next morning, I drove to Greensfield for the interview. The manager, Mr. Harris, greeted me with a smile, but as soon as we sat down, his expression changed. "Maureen," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you. We received a call yesterday from someone saying you have a history of embezzlement. Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" I was shocked.
"No, sir."
"That's completely false. I've never been in any kind of trouble." Mr. Harris looked at me sympathetically but said, "I'm sorry, but we can't move forward with your application." I drove home in silence, my mind racing. I couldn't understand who would say such a thing about me. Over the next few weeks, I applied to several other jobs. I got interviews, but every single one of them canceled at the last minute. One employer, a woman named Mrs. Jenkins, was kind enough to tell me that someone had called and said I had a criminal record. One night, after my parents had gone to bed, I decided to snoop around. I went into Lillian's study and found a small red notebook. In it were the names of all the places I'd applied for jobs, with little red X's next to them. I realized then that it was my parents who were sabotaging my job applications. The next morning, I confronted them. I threw the notebook on the kitchen table and said, "Explain this." Lillian started crying and said, "I did it because I love you. The world out there is too dangerous for you." Victor just sat there, calm as ever, and said, "We're just trying to protect you. You're not ready to be on your own." I was furious. I'm 26 years old. I have the right to a life of my own. Victor then said, "If you leave this house, you leave with nothing. No money, no documents." I thought he was bluffing, but when I checked my bank account, all my savings were gone. That night, I packed a small backpack with a few clothes, a toothbrush, and a photo of my grandmother, Beatrice. When I opened the front door, Lillian stood in the hallway, her arms crossed. "If you leave, you're no longer our daughter," she said. I walked out into the cold night, with only $15 in my pocket and a phone with 10% battery. I had nowhere to go. I ended up at a gas station, sitting on the curb, feeling completely lost. A few days later, I found the Riverdale Community Shelter. It was a converted old warehouse, with a musty smell and fluorescent lights that buzzed all night. The woman who ran the shelter, Mrs. Davis, was kind. She didn't ask me any questions, just gave me a towel and showed me to my bed. I started the process of getting new documents, but without my Social Security card, it was a long and frustrating process. I also kept applying for jobs, this time in towns even farther away. But no matter how far I went, my parents seemed to be one step ahead. One time, I applied for a job at a restaurant in a town called Fairview, 40 miles away. I got an interview, but then the manager called to say they'd received an email with what looked like a police report about me. I knew it was my father. He had worked in a bank for so long that he knew how to create official-looking documents. I was at my lowest point. I was living in the shelter with no job, and my parents kept sending me texts saying, "Come home and apologize, and we'll forgive you." But I refused. I knew I couldn't go back to that life. Then one day, Mrs. Davis told me that a woman had come to the shelter asking about me. She left a business card. The woman's name was Iris, and she was a licensed private investigator. At first, I thought it was my parents doing trying to track me down. But there was something about the way Iris came to the shelter in person and the calm look on her face that made me think it was different. A few weeks later, Mrs. Davis called me into her office. She said, "I got a call from someone claiming to be a social worker. They said you have a history of violence and that you're a danger to the other residents." I knew it was Lillian. I was so angry. I was done being pushed around. I remembered what my grandmother had told me once. She said, "If things ever get really bad, someone will come for you. Don't be afraid." I decided to call Iris. The next morning, Iris showed up at the shelter. She was in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and a no-nonsense look. She carried a brown leather briefcase. She sat down next to me and said, "My name is Iris. Your grandmother, Beatrice, hired me 12 years ago. She paid me a retainer to keep an eye on your parents." I was stunned. Iris opened the briefcase and showed me a letter from my grandmother. It said, "Maureen, I knew this day would come. I've spent my life trying to protect you from your parents' control. Inside this case is your way out. Use it for your freedom." Iris also showed me a folder full of evidence. There were recordings of Lillian's phone calls to my employers, emails from an anonymous account that traced back to our house, and photos of the red notebook. It was all admissible in court. She also told me that my grandmother had sold her farm 12 years ago for $320,000. She had put the money in a trust, and I was the sole beneficiary. The trust was managed by a lawyer, Mr. Collins, in Greensfield. I was in shock. I had no idea my grandmother had planned all of this. With the help of Iris, I went to see Mr. Collins. He verified my identity and told me that I had full access to the trust funds. I also hired a lawyer, M.S. Reed, to sue my parents for defamation and tortious interference with my employment. The lawsuit was filed, and my parents were served. The news spread through Riverdale like wildfire. People started to see the truth. They realized that my parents had been lying and sabotaging my life. My old employer, Mr. Harris, even came forward to testify. He said he felt terrible for turning me down because of the false information he'd received. The court granted a civil protection order against my parents. They were not allowed to contact me directly or indirectly. The defamation case moved forward, and in the end, I was awarded $90,000 in damages. My parents' house was put under a lien to pay for the damages. Victor was in denial, still telling people that I was being brainwashed by lawyers. But Lillian, to my surprise, started seeing a therapist. She told me through a letter that she realized she had done something wrong, but she wasn't sure if she could ever fully make it up to me. I used the trust money to rent an apartment in Greensfield. I bought a used car and opened a bank account in my own name. I also started working as an administrative assistant at Mr. Collins Law Firm. It's been a long and difficult journey, but I'm finally free. I'm no longer controlled by my parents. I'm building a life for myself, and I'm grateful to my grandmother for her foresight and love. She may not have been able to save herself from my grandfather's control, but she's saved me. If you're out there, going through something similar, know that you're not alone. Wanting independence is not a crime. It's a right. And sometimes, you have to walk away from the people who are holding you back to find your own path.